Hi, my name is Debbie Herbeck. It's good to be with you today. Twice a month, our Renewal Ministries staff, that's all the grown-ups, meet together for a Bible study. And we pick a book of the Bible and we go through it just at whatever pace we can. And we just talk about the things that kind of bubble up as questions or comments or things we notice. And it's amazing how even after you've read the scriptures for years and years and studied, there's always more. I've often heard this analogy, as I'm sure you have. It's like peeling an onion. And so I don't know where we are in the onion peeling process, but I want to share with you one verse that's been sitting with me all week that we talked about last week in our Bible study. It's from Philippians 2:14, and it says, "Do all things without grumbling and complaining." And then I'm going to finish that, but I'm going to first of all focus on the grumbling and complaining part. And I love a different translation of it. And actually, the Hebrew word for grumbling is actually murmuring, which I don't know why. I don't know if it's the way it sounds when you say it. But murmuring is such a unique way of capturing really what grumbling and complaining are all about. And so for me, because I'm Jewish and I grew up hearing these scriptures a lot in the Old Testament, immediately it sent me to Exodus and Numbers. So we know the story. The Israelites, by a miracle, have been delivered out of 450 years of slavery and captivity in Egypt. And they are crossing the Red Sea, beginning their new life together. And the time they should be the happiest and the most grateful begin their habit of murmuring and complaining. So I want to dive into that a little bit and then to have us reflect on how is this working in our lives. So I did a little deep dive, and it wasn't too deep, but looks like within that time frame, there's at least 15 to 20 separate incidences that are recorded in both Exodus and Numbers of the Israelites complaining. So the first time we see them really that's recorded is when they get to the Red Sea. And they work so hard to get to that point, and I get it, there's fear, the Egyptians are on their tail. But they actually turn to Moses and they say, "Seriously, Moses, why did you lead us out? We're about to die. We're in grave danger here." And so we see here first, as they begin their sojourn out of Egypt to the promised land, they begin it with grumbling and complaining. And then there's these instances as you go through the things that they complain about. They complain about the water. The water is bitter. Not that they don't have water, but the water isn't sweet enough for them. And then there's instances where we know they complain about the food. And they actually say to Moses, "I wish you hadn't taken us out of Egypt because at least then there the food was better than it is here in the wilderness." So they complain about food several times. I think there's 8 or 10 instances where they complain about Moses and his leadership. They complain about the leadership of Aaron. They complain about the leadership of Joshua. And as they begin this habit of complaining, it just becomes a serious habit for them. They complain. Moses goes up to get the law to meet with God. And what are the Israelites doing? Before they make the golden calf, they're complaining. "Oh my gosh, Moses is gone so long. Did he abandon us? What's taking him so long? We're bored. We want him to come back." And in the midst of that grumbling and the complaining, they forget who they are and who God is and what Moses went to do. And that gets them into big trouble because they begin to create or recreate a god, the golden calf, in a different image and likeness than God himself. And so we see this habit of complaining. And I think we all know instinctively what's wrong with complaining, but I'm just going to tell you what the consequences were for the Israelites to remind you. Most scholars say it should have taken them around 2.5 weeks to get to the promised land. We all know it took them 40 years. And so there's a delay in the promise of God being fulfilled when we complain. It just takes longer. Partially because our eyes are focused on other things and the goal that the Lord has set before us, but partially this is God's punishment towards his people. There's instances where God will not allow the Israelites to enter the promised land because of their disobedience, their hardness of heart, and their complaining. And so they are delayed in entering the promised land. And actually that first generation that came out of Egypt never will see the promised land because of the grumbling and complaining. And we know they get to even the edge. They send in spies and they're like, we don't want to go. There's giants in the land. It's too hard. It's too big. Again, the spirit of complaining that keeps them out of the promised land. And then there's judgments that befall the people. There's leprosy. There's the snakes that bite them and kill them. So there's actually the penalty of death. Not just not making it to a destination. And we all know the promised land is a type of heaven for us. But God actually inflicts on them a very serious punishment, which is death itself. And so here we are. And God, the same God who is speaking to the Israelites, is speaking to us today through his word. And he actually says, if today you hear his voice, harden not your heart like the Israelites did in the wilderness. And so grumbling and complaining is a habit that hardens our heart toward God, toward God's ways, toward God's provision. It doesn't enable us to see God as a good God, as a faithful God, as a God who provides. And it doesn't enable us to be thankful. And if we go back to Philippians, what St. Paul is telling us is there's a reason that we should do everything without murmuring and complaining, not only because it's pleasing to the Lord, but he says so that you might be a blameless generation in the midst of a perverse generation. And so we are called to be lights, like the stars in the heaven, like Abraham's offspring, like the stars in the heaven. We're called to be lights in the world. Lights who don't complain, who don't grumble, who don't murmur against the Lord, but can shine to be evidence of God's goodness and his faithfulness in the world today. So this week I challenge you, what are you complaining about? Are you complaining about food? Are you complaining about the weather? Are you complaining about what you don't have that you think you should have? Are you complaining about leadership in the church, in our country, in your own home? Go before the Lord in honesty and ask him to show you what's in your heart. And then pray for the grace and the strength to change that habit of murmuring and complaining to one of gratitude and thankfulness. God bless you.